is still very present in the mere culture. And culture is defined as that knowledge, the custom, the values that have been passed down from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And as a result of that, it becomes systemic to the point that people have these ill feelings and untruths, and that they act on them. Dr. Gordon Allport would always talk about, in the nature of prejudice, acts on prejudice, and how this whole notion that people think in very negative ways about others because of perceptions or misperceptions of others, but they act in very negative ways toward them.
You know, I heard it said quite recently that the election of President Obama might have meant that a non-racial kind of society will be issued in. Now, speak to that. I mean, because I think that's and what you're saying here is that as long as we have memory, we're going to have a problem of race in America, because we can never forget slavery, we can never forget segregation, we can never forget any of those things. And so, I mean, speak to that.
Yeah, very good, because that is referred to as a post-racial society. And we have a number of people, unfortunately many of the millennials, who have lived and benefited from the struggles of that earlier time period, now feel that, oh, racism has been eradicated, that we live in a post-racial society, that if you just do X, Y, and Z, then you can be successful. And they are really misinformed and misdirected to think that everything has indeed been eradicated. That's why when we look at this particular election of Trump, we can see how a vast majority of people have certain thoughts out there that are very racially intended, and how a particular person that way could make certain comments and everyone else could cheer in favorable toward them. Because this notion of a post-racial or post-racism is just untrue.
So over this last half minute that we have here, there can never be a post-racial society as long as we have memory in America of what race is and what race was.
That's absolutely correct.
Will always come back, no matter what the movements might be. I think you've indicated that the election of President Obama meant that we might have reached that point, but still we get another person with the memory of Mr. Trump, for example, will bring that back more than ever.
Absolutely.
Is that what we're saying?
That's absolutely what we are saying.
Very good. And so what we'll do, we'll take this second commercial break, and then we'll give you an opportunity to expand on this idea. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. It can be, in other words, there should be a period where race will be forgotten.
That's right.
You see, and you can't forget race as long as you can remember. If you remember the history, then race is always present.
That's right. Absolutely. Even if and the sad part, even if you don't, but with that operating out there in that way, people like the guy in South Carolina, that's what's kind of disturbing. He's so young, but had that in his mind to go in there and kill people. And even in his defense said, I'm not sorry, that's how I think and feel. Now, he wasn't born that way. So what was going on within his environment from birth to that young age of 20, 21 that would make him go in there and do that? It must have been something very hateful. But and you walk in there and people are loving, giving, praying with you, and then you pull out a gun and shoot them.
Or the fellow that walked through the airport in Florida.
In Florida, same thing. Just start shooting.
Took out a gun and just started shooting.
That's right.
Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. EKSanford from Tennessee State University, and the topic is the impact of systemic racism and inequality in America. And so, Doctor, let's pick up where we left off and use the last few minutes that we have of this show to sort of expand and to educate our audience in reference to some of the issues that we're dealing with here.
Okay. Yes, and you brought up in the last segment that whole notion of memory, and I think that memory is very much defined in the systemic aspect. It's so ingrained in the very fabric or culture in which we live in. Not only for African Americans and other people of color, but for women as well. That ceiling still hasn't been broken. But I also want to try to share some invisible aspects of that systemic or in that memory. In many instances, and we may not ever think about it, but there are so many institutions that are still present within our society because of the history has left people out. And if we would do a cursory look, and I challenge people to go in and Google and kind of pull up different orchestras throughout the United States and take a glimpse at the pictures there and see if you see an African American string players within those orchestras. And if you did that, you would probably end up saying, well, maybe I saw one or two, but that would be it. And you would think about looking at slavery, if you think about Roots and the fiddler in the Roots, that you knew people could then indeed play. But there was something ingrained in the society that indicated that people, even if they had an interest in wanting to play a string instrument, by law they could not. And even if they got well enough to play, there was something systemic in the institution of fairness that was inequality that said you could not be a part of the orchestra. And there are plenty of people, if you look at the literature, but one person by the name of Eddie South, whether people are familiar with this person, Heifetz was considered one of the greatest violinists in the country. And he went to New Orleans because he heard about this person that he had to perform that night by the name of Eddie South. And he went and played the piece that he was going to perform as a solo, Heifetz did, with Eddie South, and note for note, Eddie South was able to play. He said, my goodness, you should be able to play anywhere in the world. But because of the pigmentation of his skin, the systemic nature of racism and inequality, he was not able to be a part of an orchestra. Today, whatever the date is, 2017, and if you do a cursory look at those pictures, you will find the same issue right now that you would have found then. And why? Primarily because it was not a part of the culture to be fair, to allow people to explore, to allow people to have interest. It took that from people, just whatever is human nature to be able to do that. Because we know of the great Duke Ellington and Count Basie and John Coltrane and everyone else who could flourish could. So there's nothing different in that instrument than another one. But there was something in the very fabric that prevented that. So when we think about all we've been talking about today, systemic racism and the impact of inequality, there's still a need for people to recognize that that occurred, so that you would have something quite similar to an affirmative action plan that would say, let's seek out, let's look for people who have the qualifications, that have the fortitude, and you might have to do something a little different to then bring those people in to these symphonies.
Finally, Dr. Sanford, would you say that the efforts to create African study departments and various kinds of inclusive kinds of organizations on college campuses is an attempt to try to reach at this memory and really change this memory at an early age. In other words, even elementary school children who have an opportunity to live and work with one another, different races, different religions, and et cetera, that is an effort and a method whereby this system, systemic racism and inequality might be dealt with, even though we might never erase it because of memory, but we might be able to deal with it much more effectively than we're doing.
That's absolutely. And I've been in the charge of doing that now for really all of my educational career in diversity in education and having a curriculum that is more diverse, even in kindergarten, leading through high school, and then at institutions of higher education. and as a person that was a former director of Africana Studies, in all places at the University of Montana, I would have a class that had 280 to 310, and the vast majority were European American. It is very important to be able to talk about the true history in its context. And what that does, it eradicates to a certain degree the nature of prejudice. It reduces the fear that people might have. It increases the knowledge, and as you become more familiar, Dr. Gordon Allport would say, with a particular group, then you become more comfortable with allowing you to be open and fair to that group. So back to your point, I think, yes, it's very important to have this within all of the educational system to try to help people to have a better understanding of different ethnic groups and diversity in not only for different ethnic groups, but also for women, also for gay brothers, lesbian, groups of people in our society, so that we can have laws that would change, opportunities that will increase, and that would help people a lot.
The only way we can end racism or sexism in America is through diversity. That is bringing different races, sexes, and everything else together and having them to understand and to know more about one another. We can then start dealing with this systemic aspect of it. Is that what we're saying?
That's exactly what we are saying. From the curriculum to then to the integration or the segregation of programs to the inclusion. But I would like to say, social psychologically and sociologically, that it has to be recognized. If that issue or concern is not recognized as a reoccurring pattern, then you will not have an individual in there to then want to do it. So I think this education will certainly assist in that effort. But if you don't see it, then you can always just continue in the same way that it has always been done. And people will kind of applaud that. And we have to see that as a positive, to be able to be inclusive versus exclusive of groups of people being a part of. And I'm hoping that, but I've become a little discouraged that we have taken steps back more so than usual with this new election that is coming up, and that it just seemed like it's a step backwards versus a forward. Yes, and it's sad.
You know, Dr. Sanford, I think over the last couple of minutes that we have here, if we think in terms of solutions, we can say that separate institution, whether that be an educational institution or whatever kind of institution, whatever kind of race, these are things that are against this idea of bringing about a better understanding of various individuals within our society.
Absolutely, because I think one of the strong thrusts that has been worked on for over these years, even with the Supreme Court justice, has been inclusion with diversity. It has come before the Supreme Court a number of times, and each time with Sandra Day O'Connor's, as well as recently with support of diversity, not only at institutions of higher education, but also in the workforce. They see the strength, not it being negative, that you are being inclusive, that you are having different groups represented. And that should be looked at as being positive versus being negative. And I hope that we can continue to work in that vein and understand that, because there's still a lot of work to do. At the higher echelons of employment, as far as education, those who are working there, you'll still find fewer people of color in general, and women, than you will the dominant group. And so it's important for us to understand that and work toward equality in America.
You know, Dr. Sanford, I can say one thing that we've had you on many occasions, but I think that what you're laying out here is something that all of us can agree with. That is that the only way that we can get rid of racism and inequality in America is to recognize all of us as part of the American family and all deserving of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and et cetera, and et cetera. Through that kind of information that we might be able to deal, we might never end it, but we might better be able to deal with it.
Absolutely.
And so let me thank you for coming by and giving us that excellent information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.
Yeah, but it's like every time I
Dr.
walk.
Baldwin.
Yeah, I saw him rolling up.
I'll tell you,
They're knocking on the door.
Yeah, we were sort of running behind.
All right, you take
we
care.
got locked out. You know,
No, did you?
nobody was in.
You know, before you sit down,
Yeah.
well, maybe we can do this.
I was
gonna-
thinking I was at the wrong place there.
All right, we're gonna put this. You
Okay.
got a little coat pocket. Oh yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And so this is, let me get the MLK and the war on poverty,
50 years later,
This is
yeah. You might-
50th anniversary.
I was thinking of probably 3 segments. Number one, how I first became interested in
Okay, yeah.
in
okay.
Dr. King's idea of war
Okay,
on
we'll
poverty.
do it. That's the way we'll do it.
And then secondly, talk about how he actually launched
The
this
anti-
war on poverty in the 1960s
Okay,
and where we are today, thirdly, in terms of
okay.
the realization of his
Sounds-
dream, you know.
That sounds good. And let me tell you that that show that we did on the alternative. Thank you and welcome to the show today. The topic this morning is Dr. MLK Martin Luther King Jr. and the war on poverty 50 years later. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the history in a real sense of the war on poverty, Dr. Lewis Baldwin. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, you've been with us.
Oh, man, yeah.
You've just been with us.
Thank you.
In a real sense.
We've been
And
together
so
a long
I don't think that
time.
there's anything that I could say in terms of
Exactly.
trying to, because no matter whether they saw us once or 1,000 times, more than likely they saw you with us.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
I say that, Dr. Baldwin, because you bring such excellent information in reference to what we're talking about here at this station. And so let's have you to start off by giving us some information in reference to your background, education, and that kind of information for the first 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay.
Then we'll come back and we'll have that second segment, and then we'll talk about poverty. As you indicated, this is the 50th anniversary
yeah.
of the war on
poverty,
poverty.
yeah.
We've been warring on poverty for the last
That's right.
50 years officially in a real sense,
That's
because
right.
we designated it originally as what? The war
On
on
poverty.
And
Yeah,
so we've
yeah.
been waging war on poverty for the
Well,
last 50
years,
years. And
yeah.
things really, things have gotten better in many, because
some ways,
it's where
yeah.
we started from. That's
Yeah.
why they're so better.
Yeah.
When you start from slavery,
Yeah.
everything that happens beyond slavery
Is an improvement.
is an improvement.
That's
You see,
right.
but let's talk about it from that
Yeah.
perspective.
Well, I grew up in Camden, Alabama, Wilcox County, Alabama, the so-called Alabama Black Belt, and I actually grew up in poverty. And I was educated in the public schools of Camden, Alabama, which was segregated at that time, 1955 to up roughly 1963. I was in elementary and junior high school, and in 1967, I graduated from Camden Academy High School, and from there, 1967 to 71, Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama. From there, I matriculated at Crozet Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, graduating with an MA and a Master of Divinity in Theology in 1973 and 1975. And in 1980, I received a PhD in American religion from Northwestern University. But I became interested in Dr. King's ideas about poverty in the 1960s when I was really in high school, because he talked a lot about poverty, and I grew up in poverty. I was the son of a housewife and an uneducated Baptist preacher who had 4 churches and who worked at the sawmill stacking lumber and was also a farmer. So my father was tri-vocational, trying to make a life exactly for his family.
We know many of us.
So
like
I would say that my interest in Dr. King's ideas about poverty stemmed back to the 1960s when I was in high school and the civil rights movement had started, and I realized that, hey, he's talking about us. Because you're talking about people who are struggling to make ends meet, the least of these, as Dr. King called them. So I became interested in his ideas about poverty, and when I went to college, of course, I read more about Dr. King and understood that this problem of poverty was a major component of his civil rights agenda. He was very interested, and a lot of people don't realize that. They think of him in terms of his fight for basic civil constitutional rights, the right to vote, but very few realize that he had...
It went way back.
Beyond that...
Into the cotton fields.
Exactly, to look at these people who were the least of these in the cotton fields, in the sawmills, and he was actually fighting for economic justice and the elimination of poverty.
Very good. And so, in a real sense, after this 50-year war on poverty, we still find that poverty is as entrenched in a real sense as ever. Now, I think as we've indicated, things have gotten better.
Yeah.
We got a black president, we had a black president,
Exactly.
et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
And a large number of individuals have moved up. The two of us have moved up in a real sense. But nevertheless, that same poverty that Africans, that people struggle with all poor people. You didn't have to be black to be faced with poverty. All you had to do was to be an American and not have a way out.
And the resources that others had. And a lot of people fail to realize that Dr. King's struggle against poverty was never a race-based movement. He always said that there were poor whites as well. There were poor Hispanics, poor people of all races, and
Let's take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with the audience following this very, very short commercial break.
Of his dream.
Okay, that sounds good. That's good. Yeah, that's good. I like that first segment. Yeah, I like that.
I tried to connect the personal with it because, I grew up in poverty.
Hey, who didn't? Most of us did.
I'm the oldest.
And especially if you graduated after the late 60s and early 70s from one of these white educational institution of higher education, more than likely you got there primarily because you were poverty-stricken and got caught in some kind of educational program that allowed you to go to these institutions and get those degrees and et cetera, and et cetera. We all know, we all grew up.
All knew about that.
I'm from a cotton-picking
family.
Now,
where are you from?
I'm from Arkansas.
Yeah,
Hope, Arkansas.
Hope?
That's right.
Hope. I've been there.
I was as poor in Hope as Bill Clinton was in Hope.
Look at me, the oldest of 12 kids.
That's right. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and the topic is the war on poverty 50 years later. And so, Doctor, let's pick up during the second segment and give you an opportunity to expand dealing with this war on poverty, and then we'll deal with some solutions during the final segment.
Yeah, the war on poverty as defined by Dr. King. A lot of people don't realize that Dr. King was interested in economic justice issues from the time of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56. If you remember the bus boycott, he was calling upon blacks to use their power as consumers to force the bus companies to integrate. And of course, from that point, he focused mostly on basic civil constitutional rights, the right to vote. But in 1966, when he went to Chicago, he began to take this issue of poverty and economic justice more seriously. If you recall, when he went to Chicago in January of 1966, he went there to fight slum conditions and also to force real estate agents to cease their practices of discrimination. Discrimination in real estate practices. He's very concerned about that. So that was actually the beginnings of his serious war on poverty in Chicago in 1966. Running up against the Daley machine, Mayor Richard J. Daley, and the power structure in Chicago, he was fighting for the education of slum dwellers, for the organization of slum dwellers, also for what? The beginnings of a kind of poor people's campaign. A lot of people associate that with Memphis and the Poor People's Campaign as it was planned by SCLC later in 1967, but it actually began in 1966. And after 1967, Dr. King and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, began to plan a poor people's campaign because they realized that even if people had access to hotels and other accommodations, if you don't have the economic resources, what good is it?
You know, Dr. Baldwin, that became important because when we moved from the rural South, picking cotton, sawmills, and et cetera.
That's right.
Going north, it was a belief that things would get better for Africans.
That's right.
But nevertheless, once we arrived in the north, we found that the so-called ghetto, you see, which is to say that we were separated in the South. But we were not separated in the South as we were separated in the North. And so poverty.
And the economic deprivation of people was in many cases more intense in the North.
Very good.
And Dr. King realized that when he went to Chicago to become a part of the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966. So it begins there, and in 1967, he and SCLC began to plan the first large-scale demonstration of the civil rights era, which was the Poor People's Campaign.
That's right.
It spilled over from 1967 into 68. And in the course of that movement, he got involved in the Memphis sanitation strike, if you recall, fighting for sanitation workers. There were a lot of people in SCLC didn't think that he should go to Memphis. But he went there because he felt that the sanitation strike was really an extension of what he was about in terms of the planning of this Poor People's Campaign. So he was all about poverty and economic injustice, a radical redistribution of economic resources. He was concerned about health care, about education for slum dwellers, and also about getting rid of what he called this syndrome of deprivation, which is associated with slum life and economic insecurity. So Dr. King made economic justice, poverty, a part of that last crusade of the civil rights movement. That's what he was about, aside from this question of international peace. But he was very concerned about economic justice, bringing about economic justice.
Public accommodation meant absolutely nothing if you did not have the opportunity to go to the restaurant.
Exactly. Public accommodations, public access meant nothing. If you don't have the money to rent a room in a hotel, if you don't have the money to eat at a restaurant, what good is access to public accommodation?
And it was always assumed that once Africans left the rural South and went to the North, where there were buildings and indoor toilets and et cetera, that we had overcome. We had overcome one aspect of poverty, but we had not overcome the economic aspects.
Exactly,
Is that what we're saying?
You're talking about something that was deeply entrenched in the structures and institutions of this country. And Dr. King realized that, and he felt that the African Americans in the North were no different from whites and African Americans in the South. Because if you remember, the South was the most poverty-stricken area of the country, and it was not just blacks, it was whites also.
More so, because
exactly.
numerically they made up a larger number.
Exactly,
Yes,
and
sir.
King's movement was really, this poor people's campaign was about bringing together blacks and poor whites and Appalachian whites and Native Americans and Hispanic Americans. It was really a sort of rainbow coalition to try to dramatize the problems of poverty and economic injustice before the nation.
Dr. Baldwin, I tell you, this we're getting ready for the second commercial break. But this information, I'm just pulling this information together and to demonstrate that Africans who were in the South picking cotton were discriminated against as well as Africans who were in the North. Even though it was better to what? Leave the South, the all the migratory movements from the South to the North indicated that there was something better up there. But once we got there, the situation was just...
It was not the promised land, as Dr. King said. We're still in search of the promised land, and hopefully we can deal with that in the third segment.
Yeah, well, I certainly can appreciate that because it makes a lot of sense, and all the things that we are talking about, this is traced in my own personal history
and your own pilgrimage.
And I think we all made those when we went off to these institutions in the northern parts of the United States, and we saw things a little different, but we still remembered what it was like there, and then we saw the difference there. Up there, it was not, as you indicated, the promised land as we thought it would be.
And we are all products of this affirmative action program that Dr. King had so much involvement in bringing about.
That's right.
Affirmative action was very much a part of this economic program that he had in mind.
Where would we be today had there not been an affirmative action program?
I think it's unimaginable for me, you know, because,
I know it is for me.
Because so many people got education, so many in our community.
We're going to take this last commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
In terms of the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream.
That's right.
You know, because that dream has not been fulfilled.
That's right. And it's a powerful dream, too.
Homelessness and economic...
It speaks toward equality.
And if you look at what Trump, people he's appointed to his cabinet are billionaires and millionaires.
Man. Can you imagine that?
How are they expected to address the issues of the poor? You can't do it. It's like putting rich man divers on the Lazarus
that's right.
food bank,
That's right.
making him the head of it. It ain't gonna work.
I tell you, this is strange. But everything that you said, this all right.
Yeah, but if you look at this cabinet, man, it's billionaires and millionaires.
Can you imagine? I don't see how the American people can stand for
How
that.
did divers respond to Lazarus?
Oh, man.
He begged, and he didn't give him anything.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly it.
And it's a
Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and the topic is the war on poverty 50 years later. And now, Doctor, let's see if we can use this final segment to look at some of the solutions. I think that we've already indicated that affirmative action was a solution.
Exactly.
The marches, all of these were solutions for poverty at that particular time.
Yeah.
But now we are in a different time period, a different age, and now we need some new solutions and new directions.
Exactly.
And so, as Dr. King gave directions at his time, as a scholar, give us some directions in which
Now, Dr. King, before he left us, he made a trip to the Scandinavian countries. He visited Sweden and Denmark and Norway and received the Nobel Prize in Norway. And he noticed that democratic socialism was at work. There was universal health care. Every able-bodied person had a job. There was a guaranteed income for every family. There was universal education. And interestingly enough, we have not achieved that in this country. Dr. King set forth this as a dream, that we need universal education, that we need universal health care, that we need a job for every able-bodied person, that we need the nationalization of basic industries to make sure that discrimination does not take place, that we need a guaranteed income for every American family. Unfortunately, we haven't come very far in terms of the realization of that dream. Because if you look at today, there's pervasive homelessness, much more homelessness than there was in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. 20 million more people have health care, primarily because of the Affordable Care Act, but that...
And they're trying to do away with that.
They're trying to get rid of that. Exactly. And we have to understand that the whole war on poverty had to do with getting health care, the availability of health care for the poor. And unfortunately, that's under attack now. Homelessness is pervasive, and of course, there's little in the way of education for people who are slum dwellers. Both President Johnson and Dr. King felt that that was very, very important, because you had to get rid of this syndrome of deprivation and victimization among the poor. So I think we have a long way to go as we look back 50 years to the Poor People's Campaign with Dr. King, and as we look back 50 years to the initiatives of President Johnson and the Congress as it related to equal economic opportunity. We have not fulfilled those promises. You know, remember, President Johnson had this ideal of the Great Society. And the Great Society was about economic opportunity. Dr. King had this idea of the beloved community, which was about economic egalitarianism, and we have not achieved that. So one of the major questions before us as we face the next presidential administration is, where will we go in terms of the fulfillment of this dream of economic equality, the elimination of poverty? And I have serious questions about where we are going from here.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, think in terms of identifying some individuals that you know through your scholarship or whatnot who might be on the forefront of making us recognize that the 50 years that went before were only the preliminary of what should happen, and therefore give us some idea as to what are people saying we ought to do, not only we as Africans, but we as Americans ought to do in order to make sure that more people have the opportunities and the privileges that we had coming out of the South as we had.
Yeah, but you don't see much of that, even in the realm of scholarship, in educational institutions, in ecclesial circles, meaning the church, of course. People are not talking about that, and that's the disturbing sign that I see today, is that not much is being said about what Dr. King called the need for a radical redistribution of economic resources, the elimination of homelessness, the providing of health care on a universal basis, education against slum conditions. You don't find people talking about that.
As a matter of fact, as you list them, it appears that there's more activity in an effort to try to prevent people from having health care, from having homes, from being in safe environments, etc. There's more of that than anything else. Instead of reaching out to help people, it seems that people are trying to, as they say, send people back to where they were.
Exactly, and the rich is getting richer and the poor poorer. And I think Dr. King, if he were alive today,